Okay. All right. So lesson 12 we're in, um, and I'm not going to do a whole lot of this except for how it applies. Except I'm going to do the wave tops, and in fact I'm using as an outline the student guides because I got to thinking that's probably what they think is most important. So I've added some notes to that. Um, but anyway, wave top. So you see in Resource Guide 12.1, if you follow along. So we're talking about the rise of Protestant missions. The course of Christian history. That's kind of just a good, summary. The Apostolic era. Sorry, Ecclesia. Let me do not disturb. That cha-ching.
Probably the wife, huh?
Well, no, actually, yeah, you would think so. Just look, because I think I mentioned before, I've got an Airbnb, and that cha-ching is related to the Airbnb, and it's sometimes important. But I put do not disturb on it, so because you are more important. Um, Apostolic era, and then ecclesiastical era 500 to 1750, 1750 to 1900 to the church growth era, 1900 1990 global missions era, then 1990 to present global discipling era. Um, but the Protestant evangelization, though, followed the expansion of Great Britain. And we've seen that in the history as Great Britain grew, and then because they pretty much took over for Portugal and Spain or replaced them as they kind of dwindled, their exploration and their colonization kind of dwindled. So that means the Roman Catholic missions kind of dwindled because they were, remember, the main thrust of that. So Great Britain really took over that and followed so Christian Protestant evangelization followed Great Britain's expansion, and as well as the Netherlands, they were big in that as well, and some other Protestant countries, but mainly Great Britain and the Netherlands. So reached nearly every country. So in that era of global missions and church growth, um, and preached in nearly every language, translated the Bible into the major languages. If you remember the publication, I think it's still going, a Christian Century. It was big last century, and the whole point of that is if we can get the gospel preached in every nation, then Christ will come. It was just a thing of, so it was going to be the Christian century, getting the gospel out so that Jesus would come. It wasn't so much spreading the gospel, but it was getting the gospel preached in every nation so that Jesus would come, and they had scriptures to go along with that. But that was the era. So resource 12.1 again. So the rise, the movement. It talked about and if you're following in the student guide, you see a lot of this, but it assumed the oneness of humanity. So reaching out, I mean, because we can see that today, how the earth has gotten so small, the world has gotten so small with social media. But it was, they were starting to see less of those people over there and more of us people everywhere kind of thing. So the oneness of humanity, the equal worth of souls, the provision of salvation for all, and of course that was more Wesleyan than Calvinist, and the inadequacy of other religions. So thinking about the growth of Protestant mission, some of the downsides or the negatives, as it talks about, the missionaries often lived as patriarchs, and sometimes that was necessary because of the government in the area. But they would live as patriarchs. They assumed their cultures were superior to the cultures of the countries where they were, whom they were ministering to. And they were slow to raise an indigenous ministry. Um, and part of that probably because that would put them out of a job and they would lose their lands and all this other stuff. And they attempted to reproduce and replicate Western ecclesiastical forms and styles of worship. So you go to another country that everything's all different and you try to implant the way you do things, that doesn't always work. But the positive side or the positive aspects, they taught people how to read and they preserved the languages. And a lot of the mission societies, they would be just oral languages. They would get them into print languages to help preserve them, and of course to translate the Bible into that, into their language so they could read. So they established schools at all levels. from primary through colleges, and we see this, of course, in the Church of Nazarene all around the world, how that was early on, those things being established. Hospitals and clinics they established. They ran farms, established agricultural institutions, industrial schools. They helped to elevate the place of women in society, and the gospel found its way into all classes of people. Um, they weren't just concerned with the upper hierarchy or upper classes, but the gospel reached to all classes. So some of the early missionary groups, um, and we're in resource 12 too, if you want to follow along. But Thomas Bray was a name. If we were having a test, he would be on it. But founded the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, and I see the abbreviation. I picture Spock. Uh, but anyway, but their purpose was the SPCK. Their purpose was to begin charity schools in England and Wales originally, and to distribute Bibles and other religious literature abroad as well as at home. So it was home missions as well as, or really first more home missions, but then developed into world missions. And then 3 years later, Bray was part of the group that founded the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. So the SPG, I still think that would be the POTGFP, but anyway, but to assist Spock. But the SPG, they advocated the Church of England form of worship, and planted that, took that wherever they went. Um, their purpose was to minister to members of the Church of England in other places, so like in North America and in the West Indies. So their goal was to minister to those already in the church and to bring the gospel to non-Christians, but they go with the liturgy and forms and rites of the Church of England to minister to those of the Church of England in other parts of the world. And it was the SPG, um, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, that sent John Wesley to Georgia. He went with them. Remember when Wesley came to Georgia on his failed missionary trip? It was with the SPG that he went. And again, he went and wanted to reach the Native Americans, got tied up with the colonists in their church, which goes along with what the SPG did. But John Wesley was part of that, the SPG. 1705 talks about Denmark, the Royal Danish Mission, again for the Danish colonists, but also reaching non-Christians as well. So they were in India. Moravian missions in 1732 with Count Zinzendorf, you remember. And Zinzendorf himself went to St. Thomas Virgin Islands, where he encountered African slaves, and he started his work, started his, and I think we talked about that some, Zinzendorf's views on that. And of course, that traveling back and forth, that was the Moravians that John Wesley, they impacted John Wesley on those trips across the ocean, with his assurance that he didn't have, when that the Moravians did have, where they had no fear in the storms. 1782, German and Swiss pietists formed the German Society for the Promotion of Christian Truth and Piety, as part of the mission work. Baptist Missionary Society in 1792 in England, and their primary purpose was sending out and supporting William Carey. And of course, William Carey would be on the test if we were having one. And their big thing was, and their theology was essentially opposite of Calvinism. And they say that God saves in His time, in His way. So it's not a matter of um, the election, but He will save, but in His time and His way. Then there were interdenominational societies that developed. The London Missionary Society in 1795, and they didn't impose a form of worship. So the LMS, in contrast to the SPG, they didn't impose a particular form of worship. The Religious Tract Society in 1799 were founded, and they had published tracts in over 200 languages, so they were very active in that mission work using tracts. British and Foreign Missionary Society was established in that time. The Church Missionary Society, and they were very evangelical and low church. So again, not high church, not like the SPG and the Church of England. And then in 1817, the British Methodists formed the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society. So moving on, American mission agencies. Resource 12.3. Um, so Americans, they were optimistic about um, future triumphs of Christianity. They felt like, it was going to be, they were going to see things happen. And they sensed that it was their duty to share the gospel or to evangelize the world. And you can read some history books that are from a Christian perspective, especially the ones that I would say, I don't know how, but more extreme in uh, showing how God had a hand in the establishment of the United States for the purpose of, reaching out and being a blessing to the nations and sharing the gospel with the nations, because we've probably done more than, or at least in years past, done more than about any other country. So I think that was all part of that. So they sensed it was their duty, and they were optimistic about what was going to happen. 1810, Samuel Mills and Adoniram Judson. Judson. He's big in missionary. If you have many missionary classes, you know that name, Judson. But founded the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. Baptists founded a mission society in 1814, and the Methodists in 1819. This is in the U.S., remember. It was 1817 when the British founded theirs. So 1814, Methodists in 1819, then the Episcopalians in 1821. Again, this was in the United States or in the North America. And the first American societies focused on Native Americans and slaves and Western settlers. So that was their main thrust, was the outreach. Native Americans, slaves, Western settlers. 1816, the American Bible Society was formed. Samuel Mills had a part in that. And between 1810 and 1870, about 2,000 Americans served overseas in mission work. Between 1810, so that's 60 years, about 2,000 Americans served overseas. That's pretty significant for that era, I think. Um, and then alongside these societies were ones also organized by women. And we can see, of course, it was a few years after this um, in the Church of Nazarene. It was originally the Nazarene Women's Missionary Society, and that was for a long time. But a lot of times they would be more involved in the support of missions. British missionaries, again with their colonial power, dominated the 19th century Protestant missions, but then Americans dominated Protestant missions in the 20th century. The Americans just took over as far as the sheer volume and work that they did. Any questions on that before we go on? Okay. 12.4 again. So this is wave tops. So you've done the reading, so you've got all the nooks and crannies filled in there, but this is wave tops. So Henry Venn and Rufus Anderson, and this, so getting into some of the philosophy of missions. Anderson, his big thing was reacting against the civilizing. That's easy. Civilizing. Yeah. So he reacted against that. The civilizing. Yeah, that's easy enough. Civilizing, just like it says. Or westernizing, bringing in and what that. So he rebuffed that against that. Uh, he felt like an ideal missionary strategy was that of Paul, who established the churches that were self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating. So that was Anderson's thing, and he believed that mission was essential to what it meant to be the church. And I think Matt, you had posted something about that. Was that missions? No, what was that? Recently on Facebook, you posted something to say, "Oh, a missional church." That's redundant. A church should be missional if it's a church. Yeah, and that's Anderson's view, exactly. That to be the church is to be mission minded, um, and as local churches, as churches were established, they should be mission sending centers. See, and that happened. I remember years ago, and it was a problem. years ago, um, because in the Church of Nazarene, our missions are sent through our general church. I mean, because there's the approval process, the assessment and approval, and but the Korean Church of the Nazarene sent a missionary somewhere that didn't go through that process, and now Anderson would say, "Hey, that's great," but then, of course, being part of a denomination, we do it a certain way. But that's the kind of thing Anderson was talking about. Local churches should become mission sending centers. Um,
What was the outcome of that?
I don't remember. See, and that's usually the way it is. You remember the bad stuff, you don't remember the good stuff. I'm sure it got worked out, but I was young then. I mean, it was because it was a bit ago. But I'm sure that that it all got worked out because we're nice people in the Church of the Nazarene. We work things out. We don't,
Yeah.
um, um, yeah. And his Anderson didn't like we talked about how a lot of the mission work would involve creating schools from primary through college. He didn't think that was the thing to do, but thought that the schools on mission fields should be training national preachers and teachers, again, to become self-sufficient and self-propagating. Now, Henry Venn, again, thinking about the philosophy of missions here, he emphasized the imperative of preaching. So he thought it was important that missionaries would understand and be able to speak the language well. And also, as it says, getting the Bible translated quickly. Um, and his big thing, again, like Anderson, as soon as possible, the local leaders should take over. So the missionaries should work their way out of a job, um, um, promoting self-reliance and rather not dependency, and then get the local leaders going. And I think we're good with that in the Church of Nazarene because we go and we train, and we get the district self-supporting as quickly as possible, get the national leaders going. So I think we're really good with that in the Church of Nazarene. Now, after 1880, um, the tide of colonialism influenced mission activities. That of course was that was still an influence, but theory and practice moved away from Anderson and Venn's view. So later, after 1880, I mean, it caught on what they were teaching in their time, but after 1880, colonialism still continuing, they kind of got away from that. Anderson and Venn's idea of things. So with that was the rise of the social gospel. So dealing with those social issues, sometimes sacrificing the gospel or evangelism for taking care of the social needs and those things in the areas that they would go to. So that was Venn and Anderson. Other missionary views, resource 12.5 if you're following along. And if I'm going too quick or not getting deep enough, just say so, and we can go back and dig deeper in anything we need to. Um, so James Dennis, yeah, that's in. He lamented the preoccupation of previous missionaries, their preoccupation with evangelism alone, um, because of course he thought we needed to be dealing with the social side of things as well. Mott believed that preaching should take priority. Justified medical and other social work as necessary expressions of the gospel, though. Um, Spear, again, he taught that the evangelistic and social or civilizing components, I got it that time, first try, civilizing components of the gospel could not and should not be separated. That you have the evangelistic, you have the social. And then Roland Allen rejected the institutional work and stressed that the church's attention must not drift away from preaching, evangelism, and church planning. So he was one that stood firm on that. Um, and his views were rejected in his own time. Again, about it, we should emphasize on preaching, evangelism, and church planning. They were rejected in his own time, but were rediscovered in the 1960s and really became a part of the more conservative side of the church. Well, that is lesson 12 in a nutshell. The Protestant missionary movement and its impact in Asia. We didn't get into Asia there. Hold on, we must have more. Or no, maybe I thought, no, we don't need to go to Asia. Oh, that was just your, okay, never mind. Yeah, there wasn't a lesson on that. That was if we did the recommended homework from the student guide. Okay, good. Yeah, I don't think, unless anybody's plans are to go on the mission field in Asia, I don't think we need to cover that very deeply. Next month you're going? Well, we can go back and let me give you your assignments. You'll have to work in small groups here for the next couple hours.
He'll make a video.
What is the pattern? Someone tell me. Okay.
What? No question. You want to learn here. Don't worry about the time. You want to learn. If you have questions, ask the questions. All right. So Christianity around the world in the 19th century European church. So lesson 13. Yeah, I've got more. We're digging a little deeper in this one though. So 13:1. Oh, that's a good reference for you for models of culture versus Christ. So 13:1 is a good resource, and you can reference that later on your own time. But for models of culture versus Christ, so there were historical ways of thinking, and it increasingly influenced European scholars. And we talked about a lot of that, the different philosophies of the church and religion, and when we talked about humanism and realism and all that. So a lot of these things influencing European scholars. Many Protestant scholars studied the Bible using historical methods. So they would study the Bible and they would look at the context. They would look at the original intent. They would look at these things. And in resource 13.2 talks about some of these philosophical assumptions. And of course, one of the big ones in this period was that human reason could understand all things. That if we could think it, if we could figure it out, we could debate about it, we could understand it, then that it was all about that human potential, the human reason being able to do that. And of course, it was based on the revival of pietism, which emphasized experience again as a source of truth, not so much scripture or tradition but experience. And one of the implications of pietism was that truth was one. So finding truth through reason, there's that truth. So truth might be beyond human comprehension, but could be experienced directly. Again, we may not be able to understand it, but we can experience it. And again, that's part of that human potential. So most important, trying to read my chicken scratch. Oh, most important was the person's experience with the divine. In this, thinking about human reason, finding truth, so that experience with the divine was most important as we look at rationalism and the Thomistic view philosophy. Remember, that was from Thomas Aquinas. So his view was that reason and faith were separate paths toward the same truth. So that's where that experience with the divine is important in finding that truth. So you can find it through reason, you can find it through faith. There are different paths to that same truth. Now, rationalism, of course, rejected the idea of God working directly in history or communicating in history. We talked about that, and that's called deism. Deism, where God created, but he's not involved. He didn't remain involved. So they rejected the miracles, of course, um, because universal. I got it right neater. Because of the fixed laws of the universe. So they rejected miracles because nature, what we can see and observe and experiment, those were the fixed laws. So, and they rejected God working or communicating directly in history. Um, so Kant comes in here before we get into Comte and Feuerbach. Kant taught that, well, here, not Kant yet. Um, yeah, if you saw these notes, you'd understand why I'm So Feuerbach, let's no, can't. That's right, can't. I've got arrows. You should see the and I've got
Highlighters, brother, highlighters.
yeah, right. Well, and my sermon notes are the same way because I got a big post-it note I put in my Bible, and I'll have arrows. Don't do this first, do this next, and it doesn't always work. Okay, can't. So he taught or believed that reason alone cannot demonstrate the nature of God or the universe. Science became more important, and many replaced faith in God with faith in science. But Kant said that reason alone can't demonstrate the nature of God. So we got then Comte, who rejected faith. He was all about science alone. And then Feuerbach doubted God's existence altogether. And Feuerbach said God was only a projection of the human conscience and unconscious needs and wants. He was just so we have needs, we have wants, and we project that then in a God that can provide this for us. So that was Feuerbach. So the evolution theories, of course, of Darwin that came into play a lot. It challenged Christians' views. It challenged the how we interpreted Genesis and the creation account.
And
Um,
it still does today.
right, right. Even though, yeah, right. Um, So it undermined again, the defenses of the faith. The big thing is questioning the accuracy of the Bible, because the Bible says here's how it was done. Darwin says nope, this is how it was done, and it reversed the perceptions of the relations of science to Christianity. Um, and of course, now there's all kinds of different views of creation, still influenced in the church by Darwin. Some saying that, well, no, young earth, God created 7 days, as it was detailed in the scripture. Some say, well, God, when it says God created, well, he could have started the process that led to the Big Bang or to the evolutionary process, but God is still the creator and started that. And some say that God could have created as it's described in the scripture, and it so that it appears to be old. I mean, he created it, the world, and I mean, because he didn't have seedlings, and they weren't, babies. Humans didn't come as babies, so the idea that he created everything, but then science then looks at that, well, because he created it mature, I guess. So science looks at that and thinks, well, okay, it's millions of years old. Well, because God created it maturely. So there's all kinds of still this is influencing the church and our philosophy and how we look at creation. That's Darwin. Marx, of course, modern day communism, the father of. And he was all about, of course, religion being the opium of the people. Just that they um, that it was. I mean, it would pacify them. It was like a drug. It wasn't a something of significance. Nietzsche comes in there after Marx. So religion or Christianity in particular enslaved people's will to power. So if it's all religion, it's something uh, that those powerful would use to enslave people. Sigmund Freud. So he looked for, as he probably studied in school at some point, even high school, but always looked for the unconscious reasons for things. Um, and of course, he saw religion as a survival of a primitive mental life a stage of cultural development humanity had outlived. So again, that would be similar to Feuerbach's view that it's a projection of human conscious or unconscious needs or wants. So there's something in there, some unconscious reason for one's desire or belief in God. So Freud, he would say a personal God was not, well, he did say a personal God was nothing more than an exalted father, and religious ideas were illusions that represented wishes rooted in childhood conflicts not fully overcome. So finding that, and he was big on not just about religion, but things that happen in childhood, how that's played out in life. Any questions on philosophical assumptions? So interpreting the Bible. We talked about how scholars were using the historical approach to interpretation. So again, that meaning stress that the meaning in the text could not be gotten through understanding the context of the time. So it was, again, an attempt to applying scientific methodology and techniques to the study of the Bible for the purpose of determining its exact meaning. So understanding, so it couldn't be gotten through understanding the context of the time. So a study of, and that's how we're taught today. I mean, we look at the context, when the author was writing, when God inspired that, the things that were going on. So lower criticism, that's a term that would be on the test if we were having one. Lower criticism sought to uncover the most reliable text, while higher criticism pursued questions of historical background, authorship, dating, word studies, and so on. That make sense? So Bengel, Bengel, from Germany, he said that the meanings should be based strictly on a grammatical analysis of the text, not on theological presuppositions. And that sounds not so bad, because we don't want to do the eisegesis, but the exegesis. So we don't want to take our theological presuppositions, but it's the grammatical analysis isn't always sufficient either. But Bengel was used a lot by John Wesley, especially in his notes on the New Testament. He referred a lot to this Bengel guy, Bengel, from Germany. Eichhorn believed that the Pentateuch, that it wasn't just the one author, but there were sets of authors or writers that wrote it, and they're listed there. Then the Tübingen School. Again, not again, but Hegel influenced what that school taught. Not a physical school, but the school of thought. So a dialectical process taking place in that biblical material. So this Tübingen school of thought hypothesized that the New Testament, with the exception of Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Revelation, was composed in the 2nd century. And these scholars also eliminated supernatural elements from serious considerations. So miracles, things that God did, his movement, his work that was not natural. And then there was a foundational difference between the Jesus of history and the Jesus of faith. So what we get from history about Jesus isn't the one that we necessarily believe in. A foundational difference between the Jesus of history. Why did I write that down when I was printed there? Anyway, I'll blame that on my interruptions during the day.
So who was it says the Tübingen school, but who was was there any reference to Tübingen?
Probably so.
Maybe it was just tubular thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, and
I just
yeah,
the
well,
thought of him influencing someone that much to be written about here.
mhm.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I mean, was he that heretical that gets included here?
Mhm. I obviously didn't think it was that important to mention in my notes, but I understand what you're saying. If it was that important, I mean, huh. Bateman, Jowett, Cambridge, Wolcott.
That's all right. We'll just go by your word.
Not that important. Well, if you ask, I mean, I don't want to leave you. And it's not. I'm not familiar enough with Tübingen.
Mentions this George Hegel here,
Mm-hmm.
and then it mentions him down at a little bit further down.
So
So it says
Ferdinand Bauer, 1792-1860, was the founder of the Tübingen school, who was influenced by the philosophy of George Hegel to see dialectical processes taking place in the biblical material. So the school of thought saw competing ideas in both testaments, contrasting, for instance, what it perceived to be Petrine as against Pauline groups in the early church. Only out of such conflicts did consensus in the church emerge. Tübingen scholars hypothesized that the New Testament, with the exception of those books I mentioned before, was composed in the 2nd century. These scholars also eliminated supernatural elements, which I said, um, and it doesn't say much more about it. So essentially, Ferdinand Bauer, who was influenced by Hegel, developed that school of thought.
Well, I mean, it must not have been so important that we haven't never heard of that in our everyday.
Yeah, right. Right, and
Not every day.
it's just barely mentioned here. It's got a paragraph or two.
so what you're saying is that should make the top 20.
No, I wouldn't think it would. No,
Well, I have you right.
no. Sorry.
But it's the top 20 in your perspective, though.
Yeah, if you have a good paragraph explaining why it is in the top 20, then that's fine. All right, now Great Britain scholars, 13.4. Just quickly, Benjamin Jowett. He denied the importance of miracles to substantiate the authority of the Bible. Rather, he said the authority of the Bible rested in its spiritual and moral worth. See, remember, was it John that said, these signs I write because, I mean, that was a proof. But then Jowett's saying, these miracles, you don't need those to substantiate the authority, that the spiritual and moral worth is sufficient for that.
So can we disagree with him?
Sure. Now, and the next group, the Cambridge School of British Exegetes, their commentaries. So commentary Westcott, Lightfoot, Hort, and I think I've seen in like Beacon, some of our old Nazarene scholars refer, because I recognize Lightfoot and Westcott, I think refer to them. But these guys' commentaries on the New Testament pay close attention to the Bible's every syllable and grammatical tense. So it really looked at the use of language and use that to help interpret what was actually being said. Blending grammar, which, and of course that goes on. You can read that, but blending that, the grammar, lexicography, historical backgrounds, while giving attention to critical textual problems. So modern theology in Germany is 13.5. Schleiermacher, the father of modern theology. So he's someone you would know if and we were having a test. But through him, Pietism gave fresh theological vision to the church. So he said, life uninformed by the cultivation of personal religion and religious community was sterile, artificial, and out of sync with universal being. I like that. He believed that piety contributed to the well-being of society. So when we live right, when we live pious lives, that contributes to the society doing well. And then 13:10.
So that was Schleiermacher.
Yeah, Schleiermacher. So Schleiermacher's aim was to create an eternal covenant between the living Christian faith and an independent and freely working science. A covenant by the terms of which science is not hindered and faith is not excluded. Religion, as Schleiermacher defined it, was a much deeper, emotional, primordial impulse than either reason or theology, either knowing or doing. A religion was not confined to beliefs. It began with experience, not the Bible. This is according to Schleiermacher. Religion was grounded in the structure of human existence and manifested itself in all of life's forms. So, on that basis, religion and culture had an integral relation to each other. Because he put a lot on experience and that religion.
Wesley quarter level.
Right. But he would say, though, it began with experience, not the Bible. Where Wesley, of course, with his quadrilateral would say it begins with the Bible and experience confirms what the Bible teaches. But yes, that is part of that. So that's Schleiermacher. Ritschl, he rejected both philosophy and traditional dogma. Jesus was unique, Ritschl said, not because of his supernatural divinity, but because of his unique revelation from and relation to God. His unique revelation from and relation to God. That's Jesus' significance. Jesus taught us how to approach God and how to live ethically in this world. So that for Ritschl was his uniqueness, not his supernaturalness, but his revelation from God and his relation to God.
He could have just as well been Muhammad's brother.
Yeah, right, right. So nothing supernatural there. Yeah, exactly. Then Harnack, Adolf von Harnack, church historian, he analyzed the events using a dialectical Hegelian, which of course Hegel influenced. Remember that other school of thought, what we talked about before. So that conceptual framework that depicted history moving forward by the constant of conflict. So conflict, history move forward. So any Christian practice or doctrine could be judged by its fidelity to the gospel, Harnack said. Any Christian practice or doctrine could be judged by could be judged by its fidelity to the gospel. So how true is it to the gospel? Whatever practice or doctrine we're espousing, it has to line up with the gospel. And then for Harnack, Christian faith was not the sum of doctrines, but a disposition of the heart, which sounds good. And it rested on Jesus Christ and his teachings. All right. So modern theology, resource 13.6, modern theology in Germany. So I really do need to write better. 13.13. Okay, I got it. So Trollish. He looked at Christianity from a sociological point of view. He tried to show from both history and theology that Christianity had the highest value for society. And we'll look at that. I mean, when we get into Christian ethics the next class, we'll look at that. So, we'll just save that for then. But for him, for Trollich, history and theology, both history and theology, Christianity had the highest value for society. So it did good. Christianity's value was the positive impact it had on society. So from a pure functional point of view, modern culture needed Christianity. Again, he was looking at society and Christianity makes society better. So that's its value. So he compared sex, and we talked about that, remember, with the established church, the state church. Those outside of the state church were really considered sects because they didn't do the things that a church did. So Trollich compared sex to the church, and he said the church was open to the secular world and buttressed and stabilized the social order, while members of sects sought personal perfection through separation from the world's institutions. So he saw the institutional church as being valuable because it supported, positively influenced society, while those outside of the institutional church, the sects, they in their piety and their pursuit of holiness, they separate from the world, so they don't have the same impact on society. So his description of this distinction was based on the system of, well, we talked about the state churches and the dissenting bodies, which would be the sects. So that the rest of 13:6, I can't remember if we plan on getting into that or not. It's 7, we might, but just definitions of how to best recognize a church compared to a sect. And I remember reading in a national magazine again years ago, it referred to the Church of the Nazarene as a sect, and that really bothered me. And I was young at the time because we weren't a sect; we were a church. Well, even back then, I think trying to say still a movement. But anyway,
these two categories, you would probably rather be under the sect category if you read the attributes under that.
yeah, from Trolloch's point of view.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. But I think we come back to that later. I think if we have time for a group activity. So looking at modern theology then, resource 13:7. I should, because I get off the screen and I'm sure whoever might watch that wonders, where's he keep going? He's going for a drink. I don't know if Diana will want to watch it. 13:7 is a modern theology. So in Denmark, Soren Kierkegaard, that should be a familiar term or a person, especially if we were having a test. But he criticized the church of the day, of his day. 13. So he talked about, let's get to the right place here. 13, 14. So the different stages of life. Let me make sure I'm reading the right thing. Yeah. He was known as the melancholy Dane. These are his stages of life, and because he wrote extensively. So first stage of life, he rejected Christianity and indulged in his own sensual desires. The aesthetic had no permanent relationships. Life was void of meaning. One was indifferent to choice, allowing the feeling of the movement to determine behavior. Everything was relative. Nothing was absolute. The self was the greatest good, and the greatest goal was personal happiness. Everyone else became a tool to personal gratifications. It was a succession of first loves. Society was insignificant. All revolved around the self. Even an intellectual, Kierkegaard pointed out, could live an aesthetic type of existence. While outwardly joyous, this was accompanied by emptiness and despair. So and he wrote about this. This was his first stage of life. But in this, he developed intense guilt, which led him to God. The guilt of this first stage of life, the indulgent, the self gratification. So he entered the next stage of his spiritual development, living strictly according to societal norms and moral law. So essentially, the second was live for society. Instead of, remember, the first was for self. Second, live for society. The conventionally ethical was perceived to be universal and binding upon the self. There were absolute laws to which one must conform. Life was structured and orderly. So the ethical life did not exist for the moment, but in remembrance of the past and anticipation of the future. One defined oneself within a historical continuum and social context. One established friendships and life relationships, including marriage. So the second stage, first stage again, all self, gratification, personal gratification, all this, using others for self. The second was a societal view, living for society, benefiting for the benefit of others. So one lived, as we move on to a third stage, one lived the religious life in perpetual fear and trembling. Because again, there's the morals, the societal norms that the person had to live by. So living that religious life in a perpetual fear and trembling, one wrestled for oneself with God through ethical dilemmas without allowing society to dictate. Truth had to be apprehended inwardly and subjectively. This was what characterized life, not the logical, ordered, and rational, but the wonder, fear, trembling, terror, and joy in which the individual bore the burden for choice. Life was filled boldly with anxiety and despair. That was what life was all about. So that was that second stage, having to live by the mandated societal norms, um, the moral norms that society dictated. So he moves into the third stage of life. The third stage was live for God and God alone. The individual stood alone before God. If one had become cognizant of the past and future in the ethical stage, or that second stage, here one became awed by how one's choices affected ultimate existence itself. If one comprehended by the senses in the first stage, and by the understanding in the second stage, one comprehended by faith in the religious stage. Men and women here stand before a higher plane of judgment than society and beyond its laws. So, to Kierkegaard, Christian life must be chosen. You're not born into it. One must encounter Christ for himself. Faith was an act of the will and a personal commitment. And Kierkegaard opposed the association of Christianity with the church or religion with dogma. So he was big on that personal commitment, that personal experience, that personal encounter with Christ for oneself. Kierkegaard. Yeah, Kierkegaard has a lot to say. So following Kierkegaard, in Great Britain, evangelicalism and the Oxford movement really reinvigorated the Church of England. So all this stuff going on, Church of England being reinvigorated by evangelicalism happening all around them, and the Oxford movement. Now, the Oxford movement took place. Anybody familiar with the Oxford movement? Took place in 1833 to 1845, and it was a deepened devotion to the historic positions of the church. So going back, remember a lot of the pietists and all that going back to the primitive church, wanting to do that. So the goal of the Oxford movement, it sought the mysteries of faith in Christian antiquity. It sought the spirituality of the church fathers, liturgy and worship, and it represented a movement against rationalism and liberalism. So really, it was bringing the Church of England back to the center, back to a personal faith, closer to a personal faith than what it had been. And that was the Oxford movement. And so that really reinvigorated the Church of England during that time.
Let me ask you a question. Sorry.
Sure, that's fine with me.
Take it up with him.
As far as religious ceremony, how close does the Anglican Church look to the Roman Catholic?
Very, very similar. Because essentially, I have a Anglican friend who essentially says that he's British Catholic, English Catholic. Um, and the only difference, well, as the Church of England developed, especially under Cranmer, yeah, they wanted to get away from the emphasis on the sacrifice or on the altar, wanting to get away from the transubstantiation part of the Catholic Church. So they called it the Lord's table instead of the altar in the new prayer books. But other than that, all the liturgy, I mean, it's very high church. Even the Anglican, which that has come out of the Episcopal Church here, even the Anglican maintains that high church So very, very close as far as liturgy goes. Again, the biggest difference is what takes place in the sacrifice of the Mass. That answer your question?
Yes, sir, thank you.
And if you've never been to an Anglican service, you should go sometime. If this was worship, I wish I taught. I guess there's a class on worship in there in the course of study. There isn't? Oh, we already had this conversation, didn't
Yeah, we did last
we? Yeah.
week.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, that would be. This would be. Going to an Anglican service would be one I would go to. Take the class because because that's where our roots are, and even uh, I pastored, and if I've said this already, I pastored a liturgical service in Korea, and we used a lot of the Book of Common Prayer for that service, and so much of it though sounded like what we use in the Church of Nazarene in our communion liturgy, because that's obviously where we flow from. So in Great Britain,
Do you, when you serve communion, do you quote verbatim from the manual or, in your,
as opposed to being extemporaneous and using scripture and
just,
yeah,
or just,
right.
this is this is the bread?
Yeah, I generally follow the text of the liturgy. But if my worship binder, I've got two, maybe three different communion liturgies that I will use. Some longer and more formal, and some, right from the manual, and then some that are a little more developed to put significance, not significance, so it doesn't seem so rote or rut. You know what I mean. So to bring something different.
Because I know pastors who just, this is the bread
Yeah.
representing my body,
Right.
take and eat. And the others read, like you say, from
Yeah.
from the manual. So
And really, the formula. I mean, we're not Anglican, we're not Catholic. We don't have. There's not something mystical that happens. So the formula. I mean, right from Scripture is sufficient. So we don't have to have the liturgy because we're not. Nothing's happening at the table. You know what I mean? So yeah. But I'm more. I would consider myself a Wesleyan Anglican. So Wesleyan in theology, Anglican in liturgy. I mean, I've got an alb and cincture that I don't wear in Nazarene church here, but in my other different services, I would wear that alb and cincture with the stole, um, because I love the more formal liturgy, which is in our roots. But at the same time, I pastor contemporary services as well, where I wear jeans and a polo shirt. So uh, you fit the audience as long as you stay biblical.
right.
I mean, where you are. So, any other questions before we move on? Great Britain. So, John Henry Newman, um, he wanted to bring the articles. Remember the 39 articles of the Church of England, wanted to bring that closer to the Council of Trent, and he eventually converted to Roman Catholicism, and he was later appointed a cardinal. So Newman pretty much was Catholic. Talking about the closeness of Anglican and Catholic, he just jumped right over. And in fact, I we'll never get out of it if I keep adding things in. But you can become a Catholic priest from the Church of England, the Episcopal Church or Anglican Church. It's just a small step, so you can become a married priest with family in the Catholic Church if you've come out of, they've got a. It's very simple to become from Episcopal to Catholic. It's that close. And then Maurice talked about the underprivileged. He was big in the Christian socialism. And then Methodism. So Bunting and Hughes, Methodism in England grew a lot, and this was after Wesley died, under Bunting and Hughes. Now, Hughes emphasized social work. He championed the rights of laborers. He planted urban missions. He pressed politicians to conform to moral standards. And Hughes became a spokesperson for those opposing alcohol, gambling, and other vices. So Bunting and Hughes, big names in the growth of the Methodist Church in Great Britain. Um, so 13, 17. See, I had this. I don't know if I'm going to do this. A small group. Let me just ask you a couple questions. So, called unto holiness. Did you have to read that in church history and polity? Timothy Smith.
No, we haven't read that.
Hmm. And you didn't have to. You got one more course, and you haven't had to read that one at all, right? Well, that's too bad. We had to read that Nazarene Bible College. But Timothy, but that's a good. If you ever can get your hands on it, it's used and out of print now. But called into holiness, it's 2 volumes. Timothy Smith. But he comments that from the beginning, the Church of the Nazarene did not manifest the classic features of a sect, but functioned much more like a church. So, do you agree or disagree with that, based on that little bit that we didn't really talk about it too much, so did we? So, just looking at that list in 13:6. Well, just of what you know, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. Just on what you know, what we've talked about. What do you think? You think it acted more like a sect or a church? Or we could,
Sect just sounds so radical.
Yeah.
Or, you know, it's
outside the norm. Yeah.
because you know if you've read Phineas Brazil's book, I mean he just that's I mean he had the idea of coming away from the Methodist Church
And reaching
and talking basically holiness all the
right,
time.
right, yeah, and reaching the poor. I mean, he
Yeah,
was big. Yeah.
It's very missional on that.
Right.
According to that resource, I mean, number 3, membership by choice.
Mm-hmm.
4, associated with poor and the oppressed. Grace direct from God. Now, I agree with that, but I believe rituals, hymns, worship,
We have some
play an
means of
important
grace.
part.
Right.
Stringent moral and ethical demands.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
You know, it says, you know, like he said, membership by birth under a church. You know, we talked about that.
Yeah. Right.
And so you look at that, it's almost a sect.
Sect. Yeah. Yeah. But then some of these, like 12 or 13, a sect would say few will be saved, or a church will say many will be saved. Of course, that's because they say many because you're born into the church.
Well, it says charismatic leadership and lay utilization. I mean, we're very into that, you know, in the church and allowing lay people to take positions of
Yeah.
not only authority but
Yeah.
platform or whatever.
Right. But look at the other side of that, the bureaucratic leadership, emphasis on professionalism and a trained ministry. See, we're awful close to that too. And there was some fear some years ago too, as the church grew and aged, about it becoming institutionalized, more about existing to exist instead of existing because of why we were founded, which goes along with that bureaucracy. We didn't want to become an institution. I mean, we're an institution by definition, but didn't want to become institutionalized. And then that really was a lot where we wanted to be more of a movement, because a movement was something that, well, was moving. I mean, what things were happening. You know, it's not just.
as opposed to stagnation.
Yeah, right, right.
So you could take, you know, you could pick and choose out of those two lists.
Yeah,
and,
right.
We'll start that.
Well, but I think that where we are in 2023, with our understanding of society and the church, and our understanding what the sects, uh, this is back in 100 years ago. I think by definition alone, our viewpoint alone, changes maybe where we say, well, yeah, I mean, we're a church, but again, by definition, I think 100 years ago we would have been much more into the sex group.
Mm-hmm.
By definition then. Now definition today, we're very different, but I don't know that these 18 items would have the same definition today as they did whenever Ernest, I don't know if I'm Ernest, whenever he was.
And what's in a name or a definition anyway?
Right.
Today, nobody wants to label anybody.
Yeah. Yeah,
Well,
right.
And again, I'm not sure when when Smith wrote this in the
I think it was 80, 70, 80, 80s,
so even
70s,
40 years ago,
70s.
it would have been and this was probably written more on the defensive uh, than the let's take an honest assessment of where we were at. So again, the 80s we
Yeah,
probably were a church.
right.
But again, I think if we're going only off this resource, I would have to say that yeah, there are parts of us that is more church oriented, but I think the majority is that we were a sect church. If that's our defined.
If that's what we're going to use, right, right. That's a good point.
Then you're right. Certainly a sect, as opposed to an establishment structure like the Roman Catholic Church or the Anglican Church.
And I think a lot of it goes back to just form and fashion. I mean, it goes back to the structure.
Mm-hmm.
The church had a structure, had a format. Now, we almost like to not have the form and fashion, the structure. We like to be free and what do we want to sing today? And we got at 2:00, praise the Lord. Now my dad, he's very church. He wants a clock on the back wall and 11:59. We're wrapping his baby up. Time to go to the house.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Beat the Baptist to Golden Corral.
Yeah, right, right.
But it's interesting. And I think the challenge that we have is to ensure that in our modern ideologies that we are a church.
Mm-hmm.
And again, and I don't even know that.
In the good definition.
Yeah. I don't even know that I agree with these 18 points.
Absolutely.
As far as is this what defines a church and a sect? But I mean, I think that we have to be very sure that we are.
Whoever the true church is, that'll be judged later.
Yeah. Okay. And there were two more questions, but I think we pretty much covered those. So let's see, church versus sect. Why don't we take a break, 10 minutes or so. So it's 7:28. Come back at about 7:40 or so, and we'll wrap up. We got one more lesson, so we'll wrap up pretty soon, pretty quickly. Unless we want to drive on, I could wing the last two. All right, break. So lesson 14, Western church life and Eastern Orthodoxy. And again, we won't spend a lot of time on this. The Western church life, we will more, but where are my notes? But not so much with the Eastern Orthodoxy, though some of it, like I said, we'll skim the wave tops. So 14.1, resource 14.1 is where we are. So as we know, and we've talked about, Wesleyan worship most influenced by essentially two traditions, Anglican, the Church of England, and the Revivalist tradition, particularly in North America. So the Church of England, now this was 1549 under Cranmer, developed the Book of Common Prayer, which we talked about before, with their, and very much, a lot of this, well, it's got daily readings as well, but it's got, so a good Anglican would carry their prayer book with them because it's got, you don't have to, you follow along, everything is right there. So that was developed, but then it was, of course, revised, as we know. We're not talking about them again. But Wesley abridged the Book of Common Prayer. So the Wesley Order of Common Prayer, this is pretty much close to what he did back when he did it, an abridgment for the Methodist Church. Because again, he remained an Anglican priest until his death, and so he did an abridgment of that. And again, like we were talking before, a lot you can see a lot of word for word in our liturgy for certain things like baptism and communion that is in theirs as well. Now it's interesting though. So 1784, he did this for the Americans, sent it to them, and they graciously accepted it, but they really didn't use it or follow it. Uh, because the written prayers and the formalism of it didn't fit the American colonies. It didn't fit that situation, so they pretty much didn't use it. Um, and I think we talked about that later. One of the things too, he pushed for. I think we talked about it. I'll say it in case we don't talk about it later. That Wesley would say, as often as you can, receive the Lord's Supper, but definitely weekly. In worship, you should do the Eucharist weekly. Well, they didn't. That didn't work for the Americans either. They early on they pretty much went to quarterly because primarily the circuit riding preachers. That's about how often they could get around to each church was quarterly. They couldn't do it, and since it was a sacrament, a layman couldn't provide that. So they didn't stick completely with Wesley along the way. But again, not again, but the pulpit became the center, at least in American Methodist churches, the pulpit as opposed to the altar. Though you still look at some Methodist churches, they still have the dueling pulpits, with the altar and the table in the middle. They will have a pulpit and then a lectern, but then a lot of the more evangelical again move to the pulpit being in the center.
Was there, are we going to answer that? Was there a reason for that? I mean,
The pulpit moving to the
no,
center?
for
The
the
dueling
food,
pulpits? Well, I mean that because the altar was the center, the altar table.
yes. Okay.
So the word, it was a service of word and table, but it was the Lord's Supper that was the main event.
Okay.
So with the pulpit moving to the center, it's emphasizing that the proclaimed word as the main event. So not to decrease the importance of the table, but it elevated the importance of the word. So you still have a service of word and table, but the word is preeminent, primary. Um, and then, of course, the Methodist discipline had all the liturgies, um, but briefer than the one that Wesley prepared. Now, revivalism, again, that was primarily a North American phenomenon, but it greatly influenced Methodist worship as well. And they would have the camp meetings were routine then. Um, and so many things came out of the camp meetings as well. Um, and we'll talk more about music and that, but people that were saved and called in camp meetings. I mean, that became big names. So camp meetings were a big deal back then. I mean, God really worked through those in that time. And then they had regular revival services. It says protracted. I remember when I was a kid, revival services were planned for 2 weeks. I mean, that was just normal. And then oftentimes they'd be held over because God came. And now, I mean, we're lucky to get a weekend or a Thursday through Sunday or Sunday through Wednesday. Um, so the typical worship order, and you can see this now, this is in a Methodist church in North America. Um, you see that there's an invocation, hymn, Apostles' Creed, pastoral prayer, Lord's Prayer. You'd have a choir anthem, and you'd have the three readings: the Old Testament reading and the Gloria Patri. That's where the congregation would sing after the Old Testament reading, the New Testament reading, and it's funny how they have announcements actually in there as a part of the liturgy. Offering hymn, sermon. See, and oftentimes too, and in more these days, there'll often be the psalm that would be read as well. Um, Hymn, sermon, invitation, or altar call, prayer, and hymn. That would be a traditional or a typical worship order. Um,
We talked about the Nicene Creed in the last class.
mhm.
Is that something that you use or have used or?
Yeah, and it's in our hymn book too.
Right.
The Apostles and the Nicene. So yeah, of course all the creeds are in response to some heresy. So that emphasized. I can't remember the Nicene, but it emphasizes something that the Apostles' Creed doesn't. But yeah, that's one that's used. When I would use the creeds, I would often alternate or use them at different times. Again, for awareness. So
If you ask 90% of the people in the church,
what's
they
that?
probably don't know what
Yeah.
they might have heard the Apostles'
Yeah.
Creed, but
Right.
Nicene Creed is.
Yeah, but it's in
And I
our
was one of them. So,
yeah, but it's in our hymnal.
Yeah.
It's there as an option. And in the front of the hymnal too.
And a lot of people say now, what's a hymnal? Because so many churches use
Yeah,
a
right,
projector.
right.
I like still having a hymnal. We use ours all the time. We do a lot of the readings.
That's good. Yeah.
I like to, just like a Bible. They do have the scripture, but I still like to
Right, right. And in the front where it talks about the advisory committee for the Sing to the Lord hymnal, you'll see Sharon Densford in there, which at the time she was the music minister at Pasadena First. That's my aunt. So that's my claim to fame there. My aunt is named in the hymnal. Uh, anyway, and Ken Bible, who used to be at the publishing house, I think in Lowness. Have you heard of Ken? Oh, probably haven't. Yeah, I have heard of Ken Bible. His mother went to my church in Cincinnati, so we'd see him quite a bit, which is kind of neat. Completely beside the point, but so camp meeting hymns, they found popularity because they were pietistic, pietistic, pietistic. Anyway, leaning toward pietism. They were personal, they were individual centered, but heavenly minded. 'Cause a lot of them talked about my experience, singing about what God did for me. They had feelings of new. They shared the feelings of new converts. A lot of them had that excitement. Like, of course, I'm not going to think of it right now, but different excitement. But the feelings of new converts. Um, yeah, talked about that. Communion. Um, And the class meetings were big in Methodism, as you recall, and they did come to America, but they gave way to the midweek prayer meetings, which became more. They used those more than the class meetings, and they'd have prayer, they'd have singing, and they'd have testimonies during those prayer meetings. 7. Let's see, I want to ask these questions because we're 10 till 8. So, what are these changes? Not gonna ask those. We're good. All right. So music, 14:2. Uh, um, again, the camp meeting movement gave rise to that new kind of hymn. Um, and there were several. Well, yeah, it talks about the songsters, but little booklets or hymn books. Um, but they were intended to meet the needs of the poor and despairing. These new hymns that came from the camp meetings. Um, some of the prominent features, as you see there, life of the pilgrimage, Jesus is central, the gathered church, personal assurances of faith. So in gospel hymn, let's see. Yeah, in gospel hymns, salvation comes by gaining a close relationship with a kind, gentle, loving, pleading Savior. Jesus is seen as possessing mothering characteristics. He's caring, comforting, and loving. Um, Many of the popular hymns current among American Protestants were adopted and interpreted in Wesleyan ways by holiness people. So a camp meeting hymn, there is a fountain filled with blood. So it was rooted in holiness, for holiness people, rooted holiness in Calvary. So the hymn talks about not only sinners losing all their guilty stains, but about all the ransomed church of God being saved to sin no more. So that longing for salvation from sin was for the world. And the Rock of Ages was another one. It was written. This is interesting. It was written to counter Wesley's idea that two works of grace were needed. The Rock of Ages was Augustus Toplady. So he meant to be writing that the double cure is for sin, and both salvation and purity came in justification. But that's not how holiness people sang it. For them, the double cure was twofold in space as well as concept. So justification, which saved from wrath, and sanctification, which made one pure. So these hymns, and I don't know if we did. We talked about. I mean, the Wesleys were big on theology. John had to proof Charles hymns before publication for correct theology. And so many of the hymns, and this just is an example of how the hymns help to teach theology. And that's, we don't get that so much with choruses. And choruses more about feeling, which goes along with camp meeting music some, because it's more about personal experience and personal feelings. But those hymns, so they used them a lot and made, as you see, use them for teaching the theology that they were teaching. So holiness language, you see that in the references, the different words that were used. Verbs used by the Wesleys like cleanse, consume, fill, perfect, restore, sanctify, wash. Then the modifiers, the full, inbred, things like that. And the nouns, blood, fire, fountain, glory, love. And there's a lot, and you can go through the different hymns if you just open our hymn book. And if you read them with an eye toward, like the holiness doctrine, you can see the different things and how they really jump out at you. 12. So how important do you think it is that we use music and other worship forms that directly reflect our Wesleyan holiness heritage? Or do you think it's important?
I say yes. Very much so.
And why is that? Why would you say yes?
The reason that I say yes is because people tend to drift. And I mean, living a Christian life, I know that you're saved and you're set free, but you're also called to live a holy life. Church should remind you of that.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. And that's a lot of the ways too. We were talking about liturgical or high church worship. The different aspects of it are reminders of different things. Like you talked about the robe and all of the things through, like the incense reminds us of our prayers rising to God, and all these different things. So the music and the elements, that's good.
Well, I think I think we're just completely candid about people. Probably very few people in our churches read the Bible on a regular basis, but everybody sings.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we and you look at statistics and analysis. Kids having a hard time learning something. We put it to a song, give it a tune, give it a beat, and I mean, we can't just say A B C D E F G. We get to about L M N O P, we start singing it, right? Because that's how we learn it.
Right.
So I think it's important that our music does reflect our doctrinal teachings, because that may be the only way that some people learn the Christian doctrines through a song, not from Scripture.
You can have fun with singing too.
You have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's good. That's good too. And of course, a lot of Scripture was read early on because individuals didn't have Bibles. So the same way with music, that's good. That helps to teach our theology and our beliefs. Good. All right. Oh, go ahead.
Well, there was a movie out a couple of years ago called The Reader. It was about Tom Hanks starred in it.
Okay.
And he would go from town to town because he could be the only one that could read. So people would come in and pay, I don't know, a dime or a penny. I don't know what but would sit in, and he'd have a stack of newspapers, and he would read, President Clinton, did this or that, or I guess it was Lincoln or whoever back then. But anyway, you talking about, not reading or not having Bibles, to have that oral presentation given over and over and over to where it eventually sinks in
and remembered. It's remembered. Yeah.
Repetition is important to learning.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So just because you're a worship leader,
yeah, you have said them.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for us. I mean, it's easy for me as a pastor to say, "Hey, I want the songs to mesh with the sermon necessarily, right?" But do you What's your viewpoint? I mean, do you with theology and music and everything?
Well, I find a lot of the songs that we do, even some of your contemporary worship songs that are out right now, are biblically based. Not all of them necessarily, but you look at the Lord bless you and keep you, make His face shine upon you. Number 6,
Scripture.
24-26, exact word from word. So I think we were just sitting here talking about I'm a visual learner and something
Yes.
like that. You put it to a song or
Mhm.
something I can visually see, visually learn, I'm going to remember it. I can sit down and read chapter after chapter through the word and not remember a single thing I just read. It's just, I read it and not absorb anything. You put it to music, I'm going to absorb every single word of it. But one of the, as far as the music kind of meshing with the sermon, I generally have an idea of where we are going most of the time when we, especially sermon series. But some of the most beautiful moments is when I don't know,
And it
it's
matches.
exactly,
Yeah.
lines up with the sermon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's because somebody else is in charge.
Yes, believe it or not, yes,
Mhm.
yes.
It's good.
But with that being said, I also don't think we need to throw out hymns and stuff like
Absolutely.
that because those are very much biblically
Foundation.
based. They're the foundation.
Absolutely.
And I love throwing in him. We just did it as well 2 Sundays ago. And it's powerful when those moments happen.
So many churches want to have one or the other.
Yeah.
They don't want to blend it.
Right. But the thing is, and we could sit and talk about music forever. That tends to be like the hot topic of most churches. But at some point, when I'm 80, 90 years old, what I have on our set list for Sunday is going to be considered, well, that's the traditional music. Like, that's not going to be.
Yeah.
And you're going to fight for it.
And I'm going to fight for it. I'm like, well, I'm not.
No,
saying
we're
you
singing
don't
the
live
blessing song. Shut up.
Number
I'm going to
6.
another church.
Right.
But it's true.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
at one
You're
point,
right.
believe it or not,
You're right.
How Great Thou Art was contemporary music. You know?
Well, I mean, but it said right here that the Salvation Army hymns in particular set songs to secular, even vulgar tunes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, let's
I mean,
not do that in our church today.
If you look at stuff that Bill Gaither has written, is now considered a standard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But back in the day,
Yeah, it was contemporary.
like more of a contemporary thought, and people pushed back on Bill Gaither.
Right.
And now you think of him as the Billy Graham of music.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
I'm sorry to get off on
No,
that.
that's good. That's good.
But I do
It
think
fits.
it's important that whatever worship songs we sing mimics and reflects our theology.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just causing all kinds of confusion.
Right.
You know, for whoever, right?
Yeah, because people, I mean, with their pop theology, I mean, they can get what they think are truths from the music we sing.
Right.
I mean, because we sang it and we learned it,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and what I can't think of a good example, but I mean, you know, different songs that aren't our theology, but because we sing it over and over, oh, well, that's.
Well, there's a lot of songs that reflect just on me. And I've had people come to me like, can we do this song? I'm like, yeah, it's a great song.
Right.
But it puts our focus on us and not him.
Mm.
And I don't usually do those.
Yeah.
So I think we just have to be careful.
Right.
Well, you know, like in our theology 1 class, Kirsten said, hey, so let's talk about Scars in Heaven. Good song. Theology's all screwed up.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's a
Exactly.
good song. We sing it at funerals and everyone cries, you know, it's wonderful, but he's like, theologically speaking, that's awful.
Yeah.
Just awful.
Yeah. Right.
So, yeah, you're right. There are some good songs.
Yeah.
You know, I had a teen say, I want to sing a song. I don't know which one it was. And I said, okay, what is it? So we played it. And I said, you know, that's a positive, encouraging K-Love song. It's wonderful. There's not a mention of the Lord, of a relationship.
Right.
It's just, you know, hey, good morning. It's a good morning because I woke up. Fantastic. However, let's talk about Jesus.
So that's why you have to be deliberate and worship planning
Yeah,
Mhm.
and
yeah, I like that.
thoughtful.
That's good. I'm gonna write
Yeah.
that one.
And I like, and probably larger churches can do that, but the meeting of the minds, I like, when you plan worship, not just, sometimes you've got it. You come in, you don't know what the hymns are going to be, the preacher, you don't know what the sermon's going to be. Sometimes that just happens. But, I like planning because, and one of the advantages of using lectionary, you can plan out a whole year and know where, because you start with the holy days, the holidays, and you work out from there and you know where you're going to be. It's as good as a series because, and then you can plan that out and be deliberate with the choices.
Mhm.
But anyway, but yeah, yeah. So using what you're educated people now.
Oh my.
Yeah, so you using that
Oh,
to
my
make the
shirt
right
up.
selections.
Button that top button there, John. Yeah.
Hold on.
All right. Well, let's move to Christian education quickly. 14:4 is the resource, but we know Robert Rake, 1780. If he is equated with Sunday school, um, started in the slums of London. He started in his home, bringing these dirty kids out of the slums into his home, and it started by teaching them how to read because they didn't know how to read. And then William Fox started becoming part of that movement there in England as well. William Elliot, he was the first one in the United States to start Sunday school. And initially, it was for children unable to afford other education. So he taught them reading and writing. And of course, we look at missions, we do that same thing in foreign countries. We have schools to teach them reading and writing, but we use the Bible and religious literature to teach that. Then late in the 1920, oh no, first 1828, 2/3 of the children attending Sunday schools also attend public schools. So the Sunday schools, they were able to shift their focus because by then, kids were learning the secular topics in school. So it became more of a catechetical class. So teaching the doctrines of the church, leading toward membership. It became more memorization, and then but then it started working its way towards transformation, realizing that this was the age where children could be reached for Christ, making decisions for Christ. So it kind of morphed into that. Now, of course, more of the more liturgical churches still have the catechetical classes and confirmation classes, but then there's still Sunday school usually that takes place alongside of that. So in the late 1820s, adult study groups began. So it was just for children. Adults started. YMCA was a big deal with that, or was a big mover, a big part of that. And I'm sure you all know that was Young Men's Christian Association. And they were big in that education part. Um, and in fact, that continued well into 1900s as a YMCA, Salvation Army, Red Cross, several of those would send chaplains because of the young people in the military, this young adult age. The YMCA sent a lot of chaplains to France to minister to and to teach the young adults who were their soldiers fighting in World War I.
So that where the chaplain corps came from?
Well, no, it was really before that, but that they added to it. It wasn't as organized, and we can get off. We get way off if we start talking about chaplaincy. But it wasn't as organized in World War I. We've had chaplains since before there was the United States, and George Washington said, "I must have chaplains for my soldiers," but it wasn't as organized. So the chaplain corps didn't produce enough chaplains, so the YMCA, Red Cross, and these others would send them. Knights of Columbus, they would hire and send chaplains to augment the chaplain force. 1872 Sunday School Union. That more about the different denominations coming together and having a standardized Sunday school lesson plans. And then the growth between 1919 and 1955 grew 80%, while the population just increased 50%. So that's significant growth. They began to use education experts. They would hire, especially larger churches in this period, began to hire staff for Christian education. Um, And for them at this time, Sunday school was a means of counteracting the secular trends of public school education. And this was way back then, well, mid 20th century, and even more so now. We need that kind of thing.
We need to go back to that.
Yeah, yeah. And it used to be, I remember when I was a kid, Sunday school was a higher attended, more attended than morning worship.
Mhm.
And I remember the conversation was, how do we get people to stay for church? And now you can only get people to come to Sunday school. It's a worship service they come to. But Sunday school was much more emphasized.
But it also has to do, honestly, with who's teaching.
Well, sure,
Because
yeah,
if they're,
yeah,
you know, I mean,
right.
a poor teacher will,
Yeah, that'll kill it.
yeah.
You're absolutely right.
My parents sent me to Sunday school, I'm sure, because they wanted time alone. They stayed home on Sunday. They put us on the bus.
No,
I,
I think that might have been a big deal back then.
yeah, right. Same with like VBS today.
Yeah.
Every church they go, they send them around. Yeah. All right, well, let's move on to the church under Islam. So we're still talking about the Christian church under Islam, 15th, 16th century. Of course, the a lot of the Muslim conquer the Muslim um, occupations were pushed back, like Spain and the other places. Turkey really held on. Now they though treated Christians more generously and with tolerance, as long as and especially in the Middle Eastern countries. So you go down into Africa, as long as you paid the tax. I mean, they would protect you. You would have your freedom. In Turkey, as long as you didn't convert. If you converted, if you were a Protestant or Christian, converted to Islam and then went back to Christianity, you would become a martyr. That was not tolerated. Now they were, of course, Turkey an Islamic theocracy. So as it talks about orthodoxy, and this when we say this is orthodoxy, capital O. So we're not talking about being orthodox or correct, but the Eastern Orthodox Church. So it essentially was an empire within an empire. So there were civil bishops that would control the Greek nation within the Turkish Empire, so to speak. Now, since they were civil and there was the political stuff and power, a lot of those bishops would become corrupt and that system would become corrupt. But the German Reformation, the Catholic Counter Reformation, had an impact on Eastern Orthodoxy. It caused a lot of things to happen. Like in some areas, the United Church was developed, where Catholics from the Eastern Rite would be, they would combine with the Catholic Church. Others they would definitely split and be separate. But there was a lot of impact, and that's probably enough said on that. So some of the theological discussions, as it says in there, and a lot of this was from the Reformation as well, talking about free will and grace, the doctrines of the church, the number and nature of the sacraments, and the veneration of icons. Icons being much more prominent in the East, in the Orthodox churches than in the Western church, though they have some. Icons are very pronounced in the Eastern churches. And for the Orthodox, their liturgy, like it says there, it kept, the liturgy maintained the significance of the church. I mean, it was in the liturgy that the church was, um, well, like it says, kept alive. I mean, so that liturgy, which was common among the Eastern Church, it united the church because it was one liturgy and kept it alive. So so Eastern Orthodox, Constantinople, Turkey, that area. Now Moscow, St. Petersburg, so we're looking at the Russian area. Eastern Orthodoxy flourished in Russia. Of course, would become more Russian Orthodox. And as it says there in the handout, Moscow considered itself the third Rome. So you had Rome and Constantinople, and Moscow it considered itself. So divisions, that's not as important. There were those divisions there, the different things, the possessors, just talking about land holding, and the non-possessors, where the monastic order shouldn't hold land. In the 1600s, just other divisions there. Believers, reformers. We don't need to go into a lot of detail. Um, Peter the Great with the czar. See, and there was some. Um, Peter the Great would, like it says there, would accept some of the influence from Rome, so which would have weakened the Eastern Church some in that. But Tsar Nicholas kind of put a stop to the spread of Roman Catholicism, at least in the Russian area, and strengthened ties between the Orthodox Church and the Russian state. So the state assumed here, now we're still in Russia here, the state assumed responsibility for theological education and paid the clergy salaries. So the state did this to part of it could have been, to have that power of control, but part of it, depending on the czar, because there was I mean, this was our church, you know, so they took that on. So the Orthodox idea of sanctification included the whole body, and this is an Eastern thing. It included the whole body, not just the soul. It talked about the divine light. It talked about deification. So it was more than just a internal thing, but it really was a holistic thing. Let me see. It says a little bit more about that. I didn't mark that. That's a good camp meeting song. um, so the revival, let's talk about this revival from Mount Athos. Um, so Savoy, Seraphim of Savoy, a monk, healed many and lived aesthetically. He emphasized both the Jesus prayer and divine light, through which came deification and union with God in this life. So the Orthodox idea of sanctification included the whole body, not just the soul. And they gave, or their attention to missions grew slowly again. And it's interesting, they did reach out and they sent missionaries places. And of course, Alaska once belonged to Russia. And still today, a lot of, especially the older towns, you see churches that have that onion shape steeple type, not steeple, but the onion shaped top of the roof, which is very Russian Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox. So that's interesting. That influence, the Eastern Orthodox influence, is still prevalent in Alaska. And of course, they followed settlers to North America and the Balkans. Any questions on that? All right. Well, let me make sure I mark where we are here. So we did 13, 12, 13, 14. Again, that was wave tops. So your reading will have filled in all those gaps. But what was, I mean, we discussed what was, I think, important as we move forward, what's important to us in West Virginia in the Church of the Nazarene. While history, all of history is important, but really what is more applicable. So I'm going to do the videos, if that's okay, unless there's objection, for the next two lessons again, and they shouldn't be long. And then next week, then we'll just have lessons 17 and 18 to go over. And then, as I said in the syllabus, if time allows, each student will orally present highlights from their paper to the class during the last session on March 30th. So your paper.
So next week we ask a lot of questions.
Yes, that's when you bring your questions.
Yeah, right.
Bring them to the table.
But that's a good time though of sharing, and I like hearing it as well, and hearing the highlights and how passionate you are about them, and how. But anyway, any questions or comments? We're at 8:18, which isn't too bad. We'll most of the time for two videos that you'll be watching, I think, are in here, so or time is left. So if there are no questions or comments, you just want to go. All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for your attention. And as always, if you have any questions, I'm there or here or there. I'll be email, text, phone, whatever you need to do, and then don't forget next week the 2 assignments that are due if you haven't already given them to me. So whether you email or bring them, that's fine too. But then if you're gonna share highlights, you'll want to have something in front of you for that last one. But anyway, all right. Well, have a safe trip home.
Same to you, brother.
Yeah.